Final Fantasy is a staple, an icon, a franchise that has influenced not only video games, but more broadly, pop culture. It's a series that has always been known for its ability to push the boundaries and create fantastical worlds that leave a lasting impression on a broad audience. It's what makes deciding and discussing our favorite entries so difficult. However, when discussing the Final Fantasy series and the broader JRPG genre, many will turn to one of the icons of the PS1 era, which is none other than Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII followed our spiky blonde-haired protagonist Cloud Strife, an ex-soldier member with a hazy collection of his past, beginning his journey in Midgar, working with the freedom fighters known as Avalanche. However, we aren't here to dive into the story points of Final Fantasy VII, more so to discuss one character who had a minor appearance in Final Fantasy VII, but a major impact on its story, world, and events. And that character is none other than Zack Fair, our main character of Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core and its most recent remaster, Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion, which is the version of the game that we'll be covering in today's video. Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion, which for brevity's sake I will be referring to for the remainder of this video as Final Fantasy CCR or FFCCR, is quite possibly one of the most incredible remasters I've experienced that hinges borderline on being close to a remake, somewhere in that middle point. It brings the astonishing tale from the PSP to current gen consoles. It makes minor tweaks and flourishes to the combat, but doesn't stray away from the original Crisis Core, but refines it to make it more flexible to modern controllers and console, allowing for depth and player experimentation. It's a brilliant rendition, and I'm here to tell you why. So, without further ado, let's get into Final Fantasy Crisis Core Reunion. Let's kick it. The idea for Crisis Core came about around the early 2000s, when Square Enix experienced a shift in management. That new business approach would be the turning point for Square Enix that would see them focus more on codifying existing Final Fantasy games and trying to sell more spin-offs and numbered sequels, believing that this would prove profitable and successful. Crisis Core's inception was factored into the equation when the release and concept for Final Fantasy VII's movie, titled Reunion, was originally slated to release, that would later become the sequel film that we now know as Final Fantasy VII Advent Children. Alongside Advent Children was a mobile game, labelled Final Fantasy Before Crisis, which would give us some insight into the character Zack, as he made a minor appearance in that game alongside the Turks, who were the main focus. The interesting part of Zack Fair's character is how he came to be, where originally, during the development of Final Fantasy VII, Tetsuya Nomura would state that Sephiroth was originally meant to be sharing some form of connection with Aerith, from them being brother and sister to former lovers, but neither of these ideas worked, and thus that idea was scrapped. But the idea of Aerith having a lover or a first love still remained, and thus Zack was factored into the equation of Final Fantasy VII. However, it wouldn't just be Aerith that would develop a love for Zack, but the Final Fantasy fandom too. With his endearing, happy-go-lucky nature, he managed to strike a chord with fans making appearances in both the previously mentioned Final Fantasy Before Crisis and the anime OVA Final Fantasy Last Order. But after all these appearances, Zack would finally land his own game on the PSP, which would serve as a prequel to Final Fantasy VII, and that brings us to Final Fantasy Crisis Core, and more importantly, Final Fantasy Crisis Core Reunion.
A little more important than my sword. But just a little.
Eyes infused with Mako energy. A soldier trademark. Embrace your dreams and, whatever happens, protect your soldier honor.
Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion retells the tale of the second class soldier Zack Fair on his journey to fulfill his aspirations of being a hero. The narrative will see the appearance of many of the characters from Final Fantasy VII, but introduces them in a new light that is welcoming to people experiencing this world for the first time. The story of Crisis Core has a strong focus on heroism and what it means to be a hero. The relationships that are formed and fleshed out throughout the game provide a level of reflection and comparison between Zack and the soldier idols that he looks to for inspiration. The game dives deeper into the cruel and unjust workings of the Shinra Corporation and their test subjects, and further fleshes out many of the side and pivotal characters from Final Fantasy VII. While some people may find this to be jarring or as though they are retconning certain motives or events, I think that it isn't anything offensive, and I think it still works to give and talk about the broader universe. CCR is a story that, despite knowing what particular cards may fall, if you're familiar with Final Fantasy VII, it is still an emotional and fascinating story, and if you're brand new, it'll hook you in with its endearing and lovable characters. I feel a lot of my enjoyment with the story came from just how endearing and likable Zack is as a character. Whilst I feel Cloud is a much more complex character to unpack and get to know, I do feel Zack is a great character that is a simple character to understand, but I'd argue that comprehension of the simplicity of his happy-go-lucky character is what makes both himself and the events that unfold and transpire throughout the game so impactful. It's a great story, and if you haven't played Crisis Core, whether you've played 7 or not, it's a great jumping on point and a great game to experience. Final Fantasy CCR is a powerhouse of a prequel that tells a compelling story within the world of Final Fantasy. Its narrative doesn't feel contrived, and it feels as though it can stand on its own feet, being a welcoming and memorable experience for new players, and a well-crafted prequel for fans of the series that provides a sufficient amount of context and backstory without indulging in itself. It's a game that feels like any fan of Final Fantasy VII should try it, and the remaster is the definitive way to experience what it has to offer. It's a great jumping on point for new fans and a remarkable remaster for returning players, and its narrative is more than compelling. It is a great story and a great setup and a great prequel to arguably one of the best JRPGs of all time. Combat in Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion has seen many major refinements to its combat system that was seen in the PSP game. Like the PSP title, it doesn't feature a turn-based system that many of the mainline Final Fantasy games have, but rather has a more Kingdom Hearts-like approach where you run around and you use abilities to attack. And for those who are familiar with the Final Fantasy universe, you'll be pleasantly surprised to see the return of Materia, which for those who are unfamiliar, Materia is, in the world of Final Fantasy VII, what is referred to as crystallized Mako, aka the planet's life force, which is what provides the player access to the broad array of abilities found in Final Fantasy. In comparison to the original Crisis Core, the gameplay and the range of readily available abilities found in CCR have been refined to better suit the more modern platforms with extra available abilities that can be used on the back bumpers of your controller. The game has a very good variety of enemy types that you'll encounter, particularly if you partake in the missions, which we'll discuss shortly. However, there are many moments where you will face the same enemies over and over, which can come off feeling monotonous if you aren't the biggest fan of random encounters. But this is more than a minor disclaimer than a flaw, or something that I would consider a flaw, just something to be aware of if you aren't a fan of random encounters. One new feature appearing in Crisis Core Reunion comes in the later half of the game, when acquiring the famous Buster Sword, and that feature is raising the level of the Buster Sword's proficiency. The benefit of increasing the sword's proficiency would be as it hits certain percentages, it would increase the threshold of damage that can be applied, and other little additional benefits that come along the way. It's an interesting idea, and I can see what they were going for with it. However, I do feel that it can be a tad bit disruptive to the flow of combat, especially the fact that it's introduced so late into the game. It just feels like a mix-up that's just a bit redundant. And I think that's a shame, because this is a good idea, and I do think had it been introduced earlier and we got to play around with it, we would have gotten more used to it and seeing what we could unlock. And not to say you can't do that now. There is a lot of ways to do that now, but I feel like you really have to go out of your way. If you want to really do all the side content, of course you'll increase the proficiency. But if you just want an A to B playthrough, you will probably not get very far with the Blade's proficiency, unless you make an active effort to use it all the time. But that's okay, because the side missions, which we will get to, are a fun way to grind, level up, and increase proficiency. But this is just something worthy of note, because it does come in later to the game, and narratively I understand why, but at times it can feel like something that has fallen to the wayside, and can end up feeling a tad redundant. The Digital Mindwave, or DMW, from the original Crisis Core sees a return in Reunion, and is the core driver for utilizing Crisis Core's equivalent of both limit breaks and summons. The DMW spins a lot like a slot machine, providing an element of luck that can trigger a special limit break if it lands on one of the characters that Zack shares a connection with. The DMW system is also the host to triggering summons, if landing on a particular summon that has been unlocked. The more in sync that Zack is with a character or a summon, the higher the damage output and the more possible it becomes, triggering a higher and more efficient limit break or summon. Once you have all these factors married together in the gameplay loop, what you are ultimately left with is such a satisfying, fun experience for the duration of at least a 12-hour campaign to 30 plus hours of side content that can continuously feel like you have a lot of different options available to keep the game interesting, whether it's the various materia slots, the different summons and connections that you can form through side missions and the main story and enhancing those, or even just the Buster Sword proficiency if you choose to level that up. I would say that for a game that released back on the PSP, Crisis Core holds up really well combat-wise, and Reunion refines it in a way that is great and makes it more accessible and fun for a game that is asking the AAA price point. Another reason why I would say that this game is a great starting point for someone who's never played a Final Fantasy game is that not only is it like the prequel narrative as mentioned before, but its combat system is very different, and if you are someone that is turned off from turn-based combat, this might be a good jumping on point and a good experience to get you into the Final Fantasy universe. Overall, I think that Final Fantasy CCR has a really well-structured combat system, and it refines an older handheld console system and makes it more refreshing for a modern audience. One aspect of CCR that has for the most part remained the same is the incorporation of missions that were found in the original PSP release. Due to the portability of the PSP, these missions were meant to serve as a quick, bite-sized mission for the player to tackle, and to break up the progression from the main story. I think it's important to keep these two things in mind when talking about these missions, and that's what the original purpose of them were, and also the fact that this game is still a remaster. I personally found these missions fairly enjoyable, providing a nice stopping point for the main story, and an arena to better experiment and a playground to test my current materia and summons. The missions' side content always provided a continuous source of growth and progression, seeing your rank and rewards increase with each mission, and the levels and skill for those required missions get higher and higher as you get stronger. It was a fun loop to break up the story when you just felt like taking a little break and a pit stop. And I think it's really satisfying, even in this remaster. It's nothing revolutionary, but it's a nice addition. Some nice reworks to the visuals. This game isn't just a HD remaster, but this game is a new engine that's taken the original PSP's bones and fundamentals and put it into a new engine. It's crazy to look at and see the changes. And whilst the game its gameplay and narrative are still the same, so it wouldn't be classified as a remake, they have done some exceptional work here in the overall presentation of this game. And that's what we're going to get into now. The sound and visual presentation of Final Fantasy Crisis Core Reunion. Let's get into it. The overall presentation for Final Fantasy CCR is handled with care, with its soundtrack seeing the return of Takeharu Ishimoto, making renditions of the original soundtrack of Crisis Core, which, in all honesty, I'm not overly familiar with, but after playing Crisis Core Reunion can say that the soundtrack in Reunion is quite impressive, with some returning riffs and motifs that reference the famous tracks of Final Fantasy VII, and original compositions that strike that fine balance between the energetic action and the tragic, heartfelt moments. The visuals have seen a major overhaul, where the difference is night and day between the original, where both have a distinct style. Reunion leans more into the visual leanings of Final Fantasy VII Remake that released back in 2020. Whilst Reunion isn't on the same scale graphically of FF7 Remake, I would argue that Reunion has some visual improvements that are impressive, and they make changes that are just on another level for what a remaster is, and make this remaster a justifiable revisit for returning players. There are a few cinematic cutscenes that come through a tad grainy that I noticed, but I believe that this may just be upscaled versions of those original cutscenes. Again, I feel like this is just a minor nitpick. Overall, the visual presentation in this game is on point. For a game that's being flagged as a remaster, this is above and beyond what just a remaster is. The technical performance for this game, from my experience, was really good. I played Reunion on a PS5, and the game maintained the consistent 60 FPS with no texture pop-in or minor bugs. There was nothing really that I encountered. The game was smooth throughout the whole playthrough. In conclusion, Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core Reunion is a faithful remaster that in many ways feels like more than a typical remaster. I strongly feel that this title sets the bar for what a full-price remaster should be. It refines the overall game experience of Crisis Core, but still contains those bite-sized missions and many of the other bones and foundations found in its PSP counterpart. So if you were someone who wasn't won over by the original game, then I have doubts that Reunion will win you over. But if you are someone wanting to experience this game for the first time, or someone who isn't really into turn-based combat, I feel like experiencing this game, Crisis Core Reunion, may be a good jumping on point for you, with its more interactive gameplay systems and an emotional narrative, and it's a precursor to one of the most influential games of all time. The story of Zack Fair is one that will be remembered by myself and many others that have played the original Crisis Core and Reunion, and it is a game that I wholeheartedly suggest to you that you should check out. Thanks for watching.
Hey, would you say I became a hero?